Let us be very clear about what has happened here, because if you are not paying attention to the fundamental economic shifts occurring right beneath your feet, you are going to be left in the dark, quite literally. If you are sitting in Manhattan right now, or in Boston, or anywhere along that eastern seaboard and the lights are still on, you should understand that this is not an accident of nature. It is not a gift from the gods. It is a tenuous, fragile arrangement that has just been shattered by the inevitable contradictions of a system that prioritizes political posturing over the basic needs of the working class. At exactly 9:02 a.m. this morning, the physics of your daily life changed, not because the laws of electricity changed, but because the laws of the market, the ruthless, profit-driven mechanisms that govern your survival, shifted gears in a way that most Americans were never taught to understand. On the trading floor of the New York Mercantile Exchange, they were expecting a normal Tuesday. These are the people who make their living betting on the price of the energy you need to heat your home and cook your food. They were drinking their coffee, watching the bond yields, worrying about inflation numbers, the usual fetishization of financial indicators that distracts us from the real economy. And then a single ticker symbol started flashing red, the day-ahead price for electricity delivery into Zone J, which is the technical term for the millions of human beings living in New York City, didn't just tick up. It didn't just spike. It teleported. In the span of 30 seconds, the price of 1 megawatt hour of electricity went from $45 to $400, then $800, and then $2,000. Now, stop and think about what that means. In half a minute, the cost of the basic fuel of modern civilization increased by nearly 4,500%. Traders started screaming. The algorithms, those automated profit-seeking missiles that manage the power grid for the entire eastern seaboard, triggered an automatic emergency load shed warning. That is the technical speak, the polite bureaucratic language for we are running out of juice. Elevators in Boston's skyscrapers slowed down to conserve power. Aluminum smelters in upstate New York, factories that employ actual workers producing actual goods, received automated texts telling them to shut down their furnaces immediately or face bankruptcy-level fines. The subway system in Brooklyn went into low-power mode, stranding 3 trains between stations. Panic, pure, unadulterated panic. And what did the people do? They looked at the weather, because in our minds, we associate disaster with nature. We look for the snowstorm, the heat wave, the hurricane, but the sky was clear. There was no act of God. This was an act of man. This was an act of an economic system reaching its breaking point. At 9 a.m. sharp, Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't fire a missile. He didn't send troops to the border. He simply instructed Hydro-Quebec, the massive state-owned battery of the North, to update its pricing model. For 50 years, the United States has treated Canadian power like an infinite cheap resource. We treated it like tap water. We thought it would always be there, because the arrogance of the American empire assumes that the resources of its neighbors exist solely for its own consumption. Today, Mark Carney turned off the tap. This is the story of the biggest geopolitical gamble in North American history, and it is a perfect case study in how capitalism functions in a declining hegemon. This is the story of how Donald Trump tried to bully a polite neighbor and woke up to find his own country held hostage in the dark. You are watching History Shift, and the lights are flickering. To understand why your electric bill just became a mortgage payment, we have to rewind exactly 72 hours. We have to go back to the inciting incident because In economics, nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything is dialectical. Everything is a response to a previous action. 3 days ago, Donald Trump stood at a rally in Pennsylvania. You probably saw the clip. He was red-faced, energized, talking about America first. He started talking about the northern border. He told the crowd that Canada was cheating us. He said they were smuggling Chinese steel into our markets. He used words like parasite and freeloader. This rhetoric is not new. It is the classic strategy of a leader trying to distract the working class from their domestic exploitation by pointing a finger at a foreign enemy. But then he went off script, and this is the moment that changed everything. He looked right into the camera and said, "If Mark Carney doesn't sign the new surrender terms on the USMCA trade deal by Friday, I am slapping 100% tariff on every single electron coming out of Canada. We don't need their power. We have the best power. We have coal. We have gas. We don't need them." The crowd cheered. The pundits on Fox News laughed. They said it was just Trump being Trump, just leverage, just the art of the deal. But in Ottawa, nobody was laughing. In the Privy Council office, the nerve center of the Canadian government, Mark Carney was watching that feed. Carney isn't a politician in the way Trump is. He is an economist. He ran the Bank of England. He ran the Bank of Canada. He understands risk. He understands leverage. And most importantly, he knows exactly how the American power grid is wired. He knows something Trump apparently forgot, or perhaps never knew, because he is too busy concerning himself with the surface level aesthetics of power rather than its material reality. You cannot tariff physics. When Trump threatened to tax the electricity, he broke a 50-year-old unwritten rule of North American security. Energy flows freely. The moment Trump said those words, he gave Carney the opening he had been waiting for. For the last 48 hours, the Canadian government went silent. No angry tweets, no press releases. The American media, trapped in its own cycle of sensationalism, thought Carney was terrified. They thought he was scrambling to find a way to apologize. CNN ran a headline, "Carney cornered. Will Canada fold?" They were wrong. They were fundamentally wrong because they do not understand the material conditions of the energy market. Carney wasn't folding. He was preparing the paperwork. He was invoking a little-known clause in the North American energy treaties called the sovereignty exception. It basically says that if a nation's security is threatened, it can prioritize its own domestic energy needs over exports. Trump's threat of a 100% tariff was the legal trigger Carney needed. He didn't block the power. That would be an act of war, and capitalists do not want war if they can achieve their ends through the market. Instead, he did something much smarter. He applied a fair market adjustment. He said, if the U.S. president believes Canadian power is a security threat, we must price it accordingly to cover the risk. So, that 4,000% price spike you are seeing on the screen, that isn't a blockade. That is just the new price of doing business with a hostile neighbor. Trump wanted a trade war. Carney just nuked the battlefield using the very mechanisms of the market that Trump claims to love. Now, I need you to understand the weapon itself, because when you hear Canadian hydro, you might think of a nice little dam and a beaver pond. You need to erase that image from your mind immediately. We are talking about the Manicouagan Reservoir. We are talking about the James Bay Project. These are engineering marvels that are visible from space. They are terraced dams that hold back the power of entire river systems. They generate electricity on a scale that is hard to comprehend. Quebec alone produces 99% of its energy from renewables. It is the fourth largest producer of hydropower in the world. But here is the catch, and this is where the planning, or lack thereof, in the United States becomes critically important. They produce way more than they need. In the winter, when it is freezing in Montreal, they use a lot. But in the summer or during mild springs, they have a massive surplus. So for decades, they built giant transmission lines, literally called the interconnections, that run south like arteries into the heart of the American economy. There is a line that runs under Lake Champlain directly into New York City. There are lines that feed Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts. This system is called the Northeast Power Coordinating Council. It is a shared grid. Over the last 20 years, the United States made a strategic choice, a choice driven by profit, by short-term political gains, and by a complete failure to plan for the long term. We shut down our dirty coal plants in New England. We shut down the Indian Point nuclear reactor just outside New York City. We blocked the construction of new natural gas pipelines because of environmental protests. Now, let me be clear. Moving away from fossil fuels is necessary for the survival of the planet. But under a capitalist system, you do not plan the transition rationally. You do it haphazardly, driven by whichever lobbyist is screaming the loudest. So, how did we keep the lights on after shutting down our own capacity? We bought from Canada. We became addicted to that cheap, clean, reliable Canadian power. New York City gets nearly 20% of its daily electricity from the north. Vermont gets huge chunks of its baseload power from Hydro-Quebec. It was the perfect setup for a while. We get the clean energy credits to make our politicians look green. Canada gets the cash, but addiction has a downside. If your dealer decides to raise the price, you don't have a choice. You can't just switch to another provider. Building a new power plant takes 10 years. Building a new gas pipeline takes 5 years. Mark Carney knows this timeline. He knows that if he cuts the flow today, the United States cannot fix the problem until roughly 2035. That is the leverage. That is the material reality that no amount of rhetoric from the White House can change. When Trump threatened the tariffs, he was threatening the one thing he didn't control. And here is the genius of the variable pricing mechanism Carney just installed. The new Canadian policy says exports to the U.S. are subject to a stability surcharge. This means that every time Trump tweets a threat, the algorithm perceives instability and the price goes up automatically. It is a feedback loop designed to punish political volatility with economic pain. And who pays for that pain? Not Donald Trump, not the traders on the floor of the exchange. You do. The worker, the small business owner, the person trying to keep their refrigerator running. This is the crisis of the modern American economy in a nutshell. We have outsourced our critical infrastructure to the market, assuming the market would always deliver the lowest price. We forgot that markets are not benevolent. Markets are battlegrounds, and we just walked onto the battlefield unarmed. The irony, of course, is palpable. The America First agenda has resulted in America being last in line for the power it needs to function. It exposes the hollowness of a nationalist rhetoric that ignores the interconnected reality of global production. You cannot simply declare yourself independent of the systems you rely on. That is a fantasy, and today that fantasy collided with the reality of a 4,000% price hike. This situation in the Northeast is not just a regional issue, it is a warning shot for the entire country. It demonstrates the fragility of a grid that has been sliced and diced by privatization, deregulation, and a lack of central planning. We have allowed private entities and foreign governments to hold the keys to our survival, all in the name of efficiency. But what is efficient about a factory shutting down because it cannot afford the electricity to run its machines? What is efficient about a subway system grinding to a halt? This is the inefficiency of capitalism laid bare. It creates crises where there need not be any, simply because the distribution of resources is determined by profit and leverage rather than human need. As we look at the immediate fallout, we must recognize that this is only the beginning. The financial shockwaves are already moving from the energy markets into the broader economy. If aluminum smelters close, supply chains for construction and manufacturing seize up. If the subway slows down, labor productivity in the financial capital of the world drops. If the electric bills for working families triple or quadruple, disposable income vanishes, triggering a recession in the consumer economy. Mark Carney understands this chain reaction. He is banking on it. He is forcing the American capitalist class to look at their leader and say, enough. He is using the discipline of the market to discipline the political leadership of the United States. It is a brutal tactic, but it is a tactic born of the system we created. We built the casino, we invited them to the table, and now we are shocked that the house is winning. Now we have to peel back the layers of this onion, because what you are seeing on the surface, the panic, the flickering lights, the screaming traders, is just the symptom. The disease is deep, structural, and fundamental to the way we have organized our society. When the price of electricity jumps to $2,000 a megawatt hour, the first question the media asks is, how will we pay for this? But that is the wrong question. The right question, the question a Marxian analysis forces us to ask is, who is going to pay for this? And I can tell you right now, it is not going to be the shareholders of Con Edison. It is not going to be the executives at National Grid. It is not going to be the politicians in Washington or Ottawa. It will be you. It will be the working class. Let's look at the mechanism of how this pain is distributed, because it is a perfect illustration of class warfare disguised as inflation. The utility companies in the Northeast operate under a regulated monopoly model. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Regulated. It implies that the government is watching out for you, but the reality is that these companies have a guaranteed rate of return. It is written into the law. If their costs go up, whether because of a storm, a bad investment, or a trade war with Canada, they are legally entitled to pass those costs on to the consumer to protect their profit margin. So when Hydro-Quebec raises the price, the American utility giant does not eat that loss. They do not dip into their retained earnings. They do not cut executive bonuses. They simply file a piece of paper with the Public Service Commission, and next month your bill goes up. They maintain their surplus. You lose your subsistence. That is the iron law of the system. We are about to witness a massive transfer of wealth from the pockets of American workers in New York, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania directly into the coffers of the Canadian state and the balance sheets of the utility monopolies. And the government will tell you this is inevitable. They will say it is the cost of sovereignty. But notice how the cost of sovereignty is never paid by the sovereign. It is always paid by the subject. Furthermore, consider the reaction from Washington that is already bubbling up. I guarantee you within 24 hours, you will hear calls for a bailout. They will say the energy companies are too big to fail. They will say that to keep the lights on in the hospitals and the subways, the Federal Reserve must step in and print money to subsidize these high prices. And what is that? It is socialism for the rich. It is the state stepping in to ensure that the private market does not collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. When a poor family cannot pay their electric bill, what happens? The lights get shut off. That is market discipline. That is personal responsibility. But when a massive utility company cannot pay its supplier because of a geopolitical gamble gone wrong, the state opens the checkbook. The hypocrisy is so thick you could cut it with a knife. This crisis exposes a deeper, more historical failure, the failure of the market efficiency myth. For 40 years, since the days of Reagan and Thatcher, we have been told that the government is the problem and the market is the solution. We were told that if we just deregulated the energy sector, if we just broke up the old public monopolies and let traders buy and sell electrons like they buy and sell pork bellies, we would get lower prices and better service. We were told that the invisible hand would guide the electricity to where it was needed most efficiently. Well, look around you. The invisible hand just turned off the switch. Why? Because markets are terrible, absolutely terrible, at managing long-term critical infrastructure. A market thinks in quarters. It thinks in 3-month cycles. It asks, how can I maximize profit right now? It does not ask, where will the power come from in 10 years if our neighbor gets angry? Building a resilient grid requires 20-year planning. It requires redundancy. It requires building capacity that you might not use every day just in case. But to a capitalist, unused capacity is inefficiency. It is waste. So they trim the fat. They shut down the backup plants. They ran the system at the razor's edge to maximize dividend payouts. They stripped the system of its immune system. And now the first virus that came along, a trade dispute, has sent the patient into cardiac arrest. This is what we mean when we talk about the anarchy of production. There is no plan. There is no social coordination. There is just a collection of warring private interests and competing nation states stumbling blindly into disaster, dragging the rest of us along with them. The United States, the supposed hegemon of the world, forgot that it is part of a physical reality. You cannot eat money. You cannot burn stock certificates to heat your home. You need material resources. And by deindustrializing, by outsourcing the production of everything from steel to electricity, we have hollowed out the material base of our society. We became a nation of financiers and service workers dependent on the goodwill of others to keep the lights on, and now that goodwill is gone. Mark Carney's move is significant not just economically, but historically. It marks the end of the Monroe Doctrine of energy. For 2 centuries, the United States viewed the Western Hemisphere as its backyard. The resources of Canada, Mexico, and Latin America were assumed to be ours for the taking. We staged coups, we wrote trade deals, we exerted pressure to ensure the flow of cheap raw materials into the American industrial machine. That era is over. The stability surcharge is Canada saying we are not a vassal state. We are a sovereign nation with our own interests, and if you want our resources, you will pay the price of your own instability. It is a shift in the balance of power. The American empire is finding out that it can no longer dictate terms to the world or even to its closest neighbors. And what is the solution being offered by the political class? More confrontation. Donald Trump will likely double down. He will threaten more tariffs. He might threaten to close the border. He will try to use the brute force of the American state to bully Canada back into submission. But this is the trap. Every threat raises the instability metric in the Canadian pricing model, which raises the price of power, which hurts the American economy more. It is a feedback loop of destruction. Capitalism in its decline turns cannibalistic. It starts eating its own limbs to survive. So, what is the alternative? How would a rational society, a socialist society, handle this? In a rational system, the energy grid of North America would not be a battlefield for profit and geopolitical posturing. It would be a shared social resource. We would recognize that the rivers in Quebec and the cities in New York are part of the same ecological and economic system. We would manage the generation and distribution of electricity based on human need, not market leverage. We would sit down and plan, okay, Quebec has the hydro capacity, New York has the population density. Let's build the transmission lines and agree on a fair exchange that benefits the workers in both regions. There would be no traders in the middle skimming profits. There would be no spot market spiking to $2,000. There would be cooperation. But you cannot have cooperation when the driving motive of your system is competition. You cannot have stability when the driving motive is accumulation at the expense of others. This crisis is not an accident. It is a feature of the system. It is the inevitable result of treating the necessities of life, energy, food, housing, as commodities to be gambled on rather than rights to be guaranteed. As we move forward into this new reality of energy scarcity and high prices, you are going to see a degradation of the standard of living in the United States. You will be told to conserve. You will be told to turn down the thermostat. You will be told to tighten your belt for the sake of the nation. Do not accept that narrative. The scarcity is artificial. The capacity exists. The technology exists. The only thing standing between us and a stable, sustainable energy future is the profit motive and the political theater that protects it. They want you to be angry at Canada. They want you to be angry at Mark Carney. They want you to get wrapped up in the nationalist fervor. Do not fall for it. Your enemy is not the Canadian worker who maintains the hydro dam. Your enemy is not the family in Montreal trying to heat their home. Your enemy is the class of people who designed this fragile, exploitative system and who are now profiting from its collapse. Your enemy is the idea that the market knows best. We are entering a period of profound instability. The lights flickering in Manhattan are a metaphor for the flickering legitimacy of American capitalism. The system can no longer deliver the goods. It can no longer guarantee the basic conditions of modern life at a price the working class can afford. And when a system loses that ability, it loses its right to exist. The question is not whether this system will change. It is already changing, crumbling before our eyes. The question is what comes next. Will we retreat into nationalism, trade wars, and darkness? Or will we finally wake up and realize that we need to take control of the economy, democratize the enterprise, and plan our future together? The choice is stark. And as you look at that electric bill next month, remember, that number is not just a price. It is the measure of your exploitation. It is the receipt for a bill of goods we never should have bought. The casino is closing, friends, and it is time for the people to take over the house.